My name is Julie Cheetham, and I work at Oppenheimer Generations Research and Conservation as the Executive for Sustainability. I'm delighted to welcome you to the third edition rather of Tipping Points, brought to you by Oppenheimer Generations Research and Conservation. If it's the first time you're joining our webinar, OGRC is excited about creating spaces for conversations aligned to our commitment to create a conducive environment for driving impact across our African continent. So every month, we'll invite key people to share in these conversations. We want this to be a platform and a space for listening to diverse voices and opinions. We certainly don't have all the answers. It's a great opportunity to create a multi and transdisciplinary platform where scientists and economists and philanthropists, individuals from different fields are able to meet and discuss these sort of pressing topics of our times. That's why we developed the Tipping Point series. We believe that everyone's opinion is valuable, and we really hope that this platform continues to foster healthy and constructive discussions and debate around topics or themes that are important to all of us. But before we can proceed with our third episode of Tipping Points today, we're in a somber mood as we heard early today of the untimely passing over the weekend of a young friend and climate change researcher and advocate, Ndoni Mcunu. Many of you know Ndoni. She was a trailblazer and a real advocate for change, a new generation of scientists who were starting to change the conversation on climate change and really understanding how to build resilience. In particular, Ndoni focused on food systems and benefiting small-scale farmers. She was a social entrepreneur and a founder of the NGO Black Women in Science. We're very fortunate this morning to have Professor Sally Archibald with us, and Sally was Ndoni's PhD supervisor and also is one of our panelists today. So Sally, I think I might ask you to just pay a tribute to Ndoni.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you for the opportunity to remember and recognize Ndoni. Ndoni Mcunu was an inspiring and a delightful human being. She was an advocate for stronger African voices on climate debates, as you mentioned, and she was a mentor and a role model for many young scientists on the continent. As you mentioned, Ndoni had incredible networks and connections and was truly an example about how scientists can engage with important issues and make this research have impact. But as her PhD supervisor at Wits University, I know more about her academic activities, so I thought it might be nice to discuss those and celebrate those a little as well. She was really interested in comparing agricultural development pathways in Africa, contrasting smallholder and large-scale commercial agriculture in terms of productivity, but also in terms of climate resilience and the environmental impacts. She developed this ambitious PhD with her original supervisor, Bob Scholes, and it has really been a privilege to be part of it over the last year. I think we are all crushed by the loss of Ndoni, and I think I'm really glad we have a chance to think about her here today, because many people attending this webinar will be thinking about her and be as shocked as I am by the news. But I just hope that we can support her family and each other through the grieving process. I think there will be a memorial for her on Friday, and we will try to keep announcements about this going.
Thank you, Sally. So on that fairly somber note, I'm really pleased to be able to introduce an outstanding panel on our topic today, all pioneers in their field and hand-selected to give a real interdisciplinary perspective on our very exciting and relatively new carbon topic this morning. I'll quickly introduce all three speakers broadly and then go into a bit more detail prior to each presentation. So the three panelists we have today are Professor Sally Archibald, who's working with us on Future Ecosystems for Africa, one of our UpGen programs. Then we have Barney Kgope, the Director for Biodiversity Risk Management at the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment. And last but not least, we have Dorothy Naitore, who is a leader in the International Small Group and Tree Planting Program, working very much with citizens in the field. Our first speaker is Sally, so I'll hand over to Sally shortly. She has done much work on understanding the dynamics of savanna ecosystems, particularly in the context of global change. Her work integrates field ecological data with remote sensing, modeling, and biogeochemistry. Sally is a professor at the University of Witwatersrand and serves on a number of advisory boards and panels, including, as I mentioned earlier, working with us on the OGRC-funded Future Ecosystems for Africa program. Sally, please, may I hand over to you?
Thank you so much, Julie. It's really exciting to be here and part of this very important discussion that's actually incredibly topical to much of the work that we're doing at the moment and as part of the Future Ecosystems program. Yeah, so the topic that we want to discuss today is around whether carbon credits can work for Africa. And I suppose I'd like to start by a little bit of thinking around the role of scientists in these sorts of debates. I think that the science is important, but it is not enough. And very quickly, scientists can get into the realm of making value judgments when we're discussing some of these really important global change issues. And we don't necessarily, as scientists, have the training or the background to engage in these contexts. It's really important for us to recognize when we're making value judgments and also make sure we work with people who can help us to navigate these sorts of complex socio-economic terrains. And yet I think scientists do have an important role in terms of advocacy and activism, in terms of climate change in general, and especially what we can do to mitigate and adapt to climate change. But then if we want to be advocates and activists, how can we also maintain our credibility? So how can we maintain credibility while also helping our science to have impact? So I'd just like people to maybe think about this as I go through my presentation. I will try very hard to indicate where I think that I'm just giving you my personal opinion, where I'm actually sort of supported by some strong facts and can give some objective comments. And I think it's really healthy for us to do this all the time whenever we engage with scientists around these issues. So let's start with some things that I think most of us would consider facts. This is a little schematic from the Global Carbon Project, summarizing the carbon budget for the world. You can see that the atmospheric CO2, this little blue circle, is increasing by 19 gigatons of CO2 a year. However, the amount of fossil CO2 that we're emitting and land use change through fossil CO2 and land use change is actually 39 gigatons of CO2 a year. And it's really this flux into the biosphere and into the ocean that reduces the amount that the CO2 is in the atmosphere by 19 to just 19. So without this extra land sink, this green value going in, the net carbon change would actually be 29 gigatons a year. So already the land is providing us with this incredibly strong, and the ocean, incredibly strong like climate mitigation service. If we zoom in on Africa, Africa's total fossil CO2 emissions are 1.1 gigatons per year. So that represents less than 4% of the global amount of fossil CO2 that's emitted. And the best estimates we have for our inputs into the biosphere are 2.2 gigatons a year. So if we take our best estimates for the continental scale, Africa at the moment is actually a net sink for carbon of 1.1 gigatons per year. We use minus values when the carbon's going into the earth, and we use positive values when the carbon's going out into the atmosphere. So why is Africa taking up carbon? We know that there's been an incredible amount of agricultural expansion in the last few decades in Africa, especially in West Africa. We know that there's a lot of use of our ecosystems. Fuelwood harvesting releases CO2, but we also know that at least 2/3 of this grows back again quite quickly. If we have a look at our landscapes and we use satellite data to try to see what's going on, you can see that the regrowth rates of our natural ecosystems currently, in many cases, are higher than the harvesting rates and the land conversion combined. So this green is the biomass, the change in biomass. So then there's a large area that's got an increasing percentage of wooded area. And then we have some areas of degradation and loss and deforestation. But in total, we're actually having more biomass increase than loss. So what can we conclude? That despite increasing populations, intense use, and localized areas of loss, those are the red areas, land in Africa is actually taking up more CO2 than it releases. And the best that we understand it as scientists is that this is caused largely by more trees in shrublands, woodlands, and savannas. You can see all these green values of an increased trend in woody cover over the last 30 years, and also fewer fires everywhere. So those, I suppose, are the facts. That's as much as the data can tell us. How do we interpret those facts? Well, one way to interpret it is that Africa is providing a climate service to the globe. And that's how many of my colleagues in the global north see it. I have a colleague who gleefully rubbed his hands together at a conference and told me that there's this arid land greening going on, which is helping keep the planet below 2 degrees warming. But this arid land greening that my colleague in Europe is so excited about is something that farmers in Africa are actually really worried about, because the other conclusion you could make is that African ecosystems are threatened by bush encroachment. So the same facts can be interpreted in 2 very different ways, depending on whether you've got more of an interest in climate mitigation or more of an interest in using the land and having a sustainable agricultural production on the land. So this climate service is something that can be exploited. And I think it's very important to realize that our current IPCC estimates, our estimates of how to keep the globe below 1.5 degrees warming, all of those scenarios include the assumption that there's going to be massive, massive increase in tree cover in Africa. If you just have a look, these are the sort of what needs to happen to keep the globe below 1.5 degrees warming. And there's an estimate that we need to increase by over 700 million hectares the area under forest in Africa. There's already many activities on the ground creating these projects. Carbon offset initiatives have been registered all over Africa. Not always in ecosystems where it might be ecologically appropriate to do so. So we sit with a bit of a conundrum. The global north want to manage African ecosystems to store more carbon and to provide climate mitigation, and also carbon offset services. And those are 2 different things. Carbon offset services don't actually keep the world below, don't actually have any cooling impact. They just enable fossil fuel emissions somewhere else. Whereas climate mitigation services might be actually helping to keep the world a bit cool. In the global south, there are many mixed messages. The messages range from support for the global north view to total rejection. 27 African countries have signed up to stop deforestation by 2030. 31 African countries have pledged to the African Forest Landscape Restoration Initiative, which means they've indicated how much land they are going to protect and enable the growth or the reforestation or afforestation of woody species. But then all African countries are also committed to unlocking Africa's agricultural potential. And in some cases, the amount of land committed for agriculture and the amount of land committed for forest landscape restoration adds up to more than 100% of the country's land area. And then you have a very strong and very vocal forum within Africa, which aims to utilize their landscapes to promote a circular bioeconomy. And the idea there is that we should be focusing on sustainable use of our ecosystems to create economic opportunities and improve livelihoods, rather than setting them aside for carbon climate mitigation activities. Then there's also deep concern from conservationists about the biodiversity consequences of bush encroachment and afforestation. But on the other hand, there's enthusiasm from similar sort of groups for the possibility that carbon offsets can fund conservation initiatives. Africa has been starved of funding for conservation for many decades. So there's this enthusiasm that potentially this is a way for us to get some funding for conservation. So there's a very wide range of opinions within Africa about the role and importance of climate mitigation activities. On the most extreme side, this was a tweet after the COP26 commitments, which was that focusing on carbon offsets that could never be met in your country is colonialism. So this idea that perhaps the global north is seeing Africa as a resource to be utilized when it comes to carbon offsets. What is often missing from all of these debates is a recognition of the trade-offs. You know, if it was that easy to promote biodiversity and use our landscapes and store carbon, then we would have been doing it all along. So in an effort to be enthusiastic about sort of positive change, people are sometimes under-recognizing that we only have so much land area in Africa. And if we use it for carbon storage and climate mitigation, we can't plow it. And there's a limit to how much we can utilize the resources. And then there are definitely consequences for biodiversity of any decisions that we make. So that is one thing that I find quite telling, is that there's often either not a recognition or an underplaying of the trade-offs. And then what's also missing is a recognition of the uncertainty. Like, there is the capacity potentially for certain interventions in Africa to have biodiversity and social impacts, and also perhaps mitigate the climate, atmospheric CO2. But often we don't have enough data to know whether that's really going to make a difference. This is just a small example of 4 papers published in the last 5 years. 2 of them indicate that there's massive growth and that Africa is African tropical forests are carbon sinks. 2 of them indicate that the tropics in general, and Africa in particular, have massive carbon losses. And so all of these are using different data sets with different quality at different scales and resolutions. And so even though I showed you that value saying that Africa is a carbon sink, there are massive uncertainties around all of these numbers, which means that, you know, holding on to this as a potential to help keep us below 1.5 degrees warming is a little bit tenuous. And then finally, what's often missing are an African perspective. These are 3 papers published also in the last 3 years, I think. Each of them selling some intervention that could happen globally, and particularly in Africa, that could really help reduce global warming. One was around planting trees. There's a room for an extra 0.9 billion hectares that should store 205 gigatons of carbon. This one is focusing on savanna fire management and saying if we alter the way we burn in African savannas, we can generate carbon revenue to restore Africa's rangelands. And then there's also the strong focus on the idea that if you rewild and you manage your wildlife, then you can also increase carbon uptake. But none of these papers, which definitely have very strong opinions about what we should be doing in Africa, actually had any African authors on them at all. I think there was one African author in the One Earth paper, but that's it. So what can we do to change that? And this is where I want to introduce our new program, Future Ecosystems for Africa. We have been we want to work with a number of people across the continent, recognizing that we have this temporary opportunity to guide development into better pathways. And this carbon and climate mitigation debate is something we really need to engage with as part of our program. What are we doing in particular related to this is that we want to make the trade-offs explicit, and we want to provide better data to reduce the uncertainty. We also want to highlight situations where value judgments are being marketed as objective science, and we want to provide room for other perspectives. If it's really just about how we like our ecosystems to be and what we think our ecosystems should look like, then our perspectives in Africa are equally valid as other people in other parts of the world. And finally, we want to tap into the creativity and knowledge on the continent to come up with positive interventions that can have mitigation co-benefits. So if you take the example of the Global Tree Restoration Potential paper, we have mobilized as African scientists to demonstrate several things. One thing we've demonstrated is that our open grassy ecosystems already do store a lot of carbon. One of the uncertainties and errors in this paper was the assumption that areas with very low above ground cover, these ones marked in red, also have equivalently low below ground cover. So they assumed there was massive carbon uptake potential in these ecosystems, which was not the case, just because they didn't understand the ecosystems or have the data. We also highlighted the massive biodiversity and water provision consequences of increasing tree cover and made sure that these trade-offs were recognized when it came to discussing when and how these interventions should occur. And finally, I'm working, and I'm not sure we've really succeeded yet, in making people who are making these suggestions realize that if you prevent the sustainable use of African woodlands in order to store carbon, then we in Africa will require an additional 45,000 megawatts of energy provision. That's the amount of energy that our woodlands are providing to us in Africa at the moment. In many cases, 2/3 of the case, it's clearly sustainable, and there are things we could do to make it more sustainable. So that amount of energy is equivalent of 10 large power stations. And that's not recognized when people are suggesting that we use our ecosystems to store carbon. They're not thinking, well, where are we in Africa going to get our energy from in that case? Another example, when it comes to fire management, we're mobilizing a group of about 30 scientists across Africa to engage on this paper. Our three arguments are that they're actually using incorrect values for fire greenhouse gas emissions for Africa. They're using values developed in Australia when there's many local data sets that are available that give different story, but are not used. This paper also assumes that fires reduce soil carbon when the data, again, show otherwise in Africa. So the local data weren't used. So we really need to make sure that we as African scientists collecting these data, that these data are brought into these high-level debates. And finally, we're trying to argue that there is no one-size-fits-all for fire management in conservation areas. Again, we're at the trade-offs. This little figure, the range of funny green triangles in this figure tells you the different types of fire regimes you would need to achieve different conservation goals in our conservation areas. This one at the top is how we would have to burn to promote trees and store carbon. But you can see that if we want to control ticks, we would have to have a different fire regime. We want to promote tourism, a different fire regime. Biodiversity is maximized with very different types of fire regimes than the one that will store the most carbon. So this was not recognized at all in this paper, and we need to highlight that. But we in Africa, and as part of the Future Ecosystems program, we don't want to just sit around writing rebuttals to papers published by other people around this debate. We also want to creatively engage with producing our own ideas. So one activity that we've been engaged in as part of the Future Ecosystems program is to engage with the African Group of Negotiators Expert Support, AGNES. And the aim there is to craft a compelling Africa position that centers African ecosystems and needs. We've been working to create a community of African experts who are actively feeding into policy and decision-making. Currently, I've got photographs of Ibukung and Mohammed Armani, who are working on 2 technical reports on land and on ocean, which aim to provide the evidence base for decisions around carbon mitigation activities in Africa. So this is a lot around mobilizing our networks and making sure that our knowledge and data are fed into these important debates. So just to summarize, I think I've overstepped my time already, but I just want to, and this is where I'm giving my opinion, I really believe that earning carbon credits in Africa is only a good option when carbon storage is a co-benefit from something that we in Africa want to achieve anyway. Because the amount of money on offer is simply too small to sell away the opportunity to manage ecosystems for biodiversity and human well-being. The numbers just don't add up. And until fossil fuel use declines, then we're not actually helping to solve the problem if we store carbon in Africa. We're just subsidizing a bad habit and an extractive resource elsewhere on the globe. So assessing when carbon credits are a co-benefit from other sort of interventions is not a simple task. It intermingles science with value judgments in a way that is not currently well recognized. So how can we help? We can help by providing better data and then also getting our data out there and heard. Like often the data are available and they're just not picked up by these large-scale global assessments. Then we can also insist on full cost accounting. The opportunity costs to Africans are inevitably not factored in. In all three of those papers that I highlighted, the opportunity costs to us in Africa were not factored into their economic models. And then we can also help by identifying about when it's a clash of values and not objective science. And I want to just end there by thanking the team who's been involved in this. And we look forward to engaging with many of you about important new ideas and interventions we could push for Africa. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sally, for that perspective. As you say, it's both complex and complicated, and those trade-offs need to be made explicit. And as African scientists, it's incumbent on us to bring those to light. I'd love to move on to our second speaker, Mr. Barney Kgope, for his perspective. As I mentioned earlier, Barney heads up biodiversity risk management for the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment. And within that portfolio, he covers a number of global change issues, including climate change and biological invasions. He's the author of many papers, reports, and has contributed to the IPCC. Barney has also conceived of and led several key projects, including the first National Terrestrial Carbon Sinks Assessment and the National Carbon Atlas. So Barney, I will hand over to you without further ado to continue the important conversation.
Thanks. I certainly enjoyed Sally's presentation, and thanks for the opportunity. I think my talk will build nicely on Sally's presentation. I chose to use the approach that we took in South Africa instead of speaking from a continental perspective. But I think our approach is applicable across the continent. And my talk is really coming across from three perspectives. The first is the science. In this area of work, science is pivotal. Our work depends very much on science. And as Sally stated, science that is generated here at home. Then also, I'm going to touch a little bit on the policy space. Why is it important also? And lastly, what we've learned from implementation, because we have some of the greatest flagship projects globally known as the Working For projects, where we've learned a lot. This is where now the science and implementation converges nicely to inform the policy space. So context is important. First, we have to know the vegetation types of the country. So these are the major vegetation biomes in South Africa. The two biggest are grasslands and savanna systems. And then you have the Nama Karoo, the Succulent Karoo, and the fynbos. So within these biomes, there's 7% of the world's reptiles. This is important from a biodiversity perspective, birds and mammals. Also 10% of the world flora, including unique floral kingdom in the Southwestern Cape. And also 15% of the world's coastal marine species. Now this has earned us a spot in the mega biodiverse countries in the world. And I want to emphasize that we are a country that also contributes a lot in terms of keeping and managing some of the mega fauna that is, the only remaining megafauna globally. So this requires us to manage these systems in such a way that these megafauna continue to exist. Also, it's important to recognize that from biodiversity, we actually benefit important services. And these include provisioning services, cultural services, but the regulatory services and support services are critical and are sensitive to climate change. As a result, the way we manage our landscapes going forward will determine if we continue, especially in the context of climate change, to gain benefit from biodiversity through these services. So then it's important for government to really set a national agenda in terms of, now that we have an understanding of the importance of these systems, and in the context of global change in the background, how do we manage these systems going forward? And this talk will specifically talk to two important, one policy and one strategy, namely the National Climate Change Response Strategy, which was published in 2011, and also the National Climate Change Adaptation Strategy, which was published recently. So then, the National Climate Change Response Policy's main objective is actually to transition the country, that is South Africa, to a lower carbon and climate resilient society. But this can be further unpacked into a specific mitigation objective, which is really mainly about reduction of concentration of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, or rather reduce what we release into the atmosphere. And also from an adaptation point of view, to manage climate change impacts through interventions that build and sustain South Africa's resilience. And these actually, as we work towards achieving these two main objectives, that is mitigation and adaptation objectives respectively, we have to be cognizant of our developmental needs, and also do it in such a way that it's transformative and is participatory. In other words, everyone must be considered and not left behind, especially the vulnerable communities. It must be needs-driven and customized accordingly. And lastly, dynamic and evidence-based. And we saw Sally's presentation is speaking to this evidence-based importance. So the first step then, my first task really was to put together a study that will look into what is our understanding really of the distribution of carbon stocks across the country, the productivity of these systems. In other words, know as much as we can from a carbon point of view in relation to biodiversity or the land sector as a whole. So we commissioned the very first study known as the National Terrestrial Carbon Sinks Assessment. The objectives were clear. First, we needed to understand the status and dynamics of the national carbon sink. So that included mapping the geographic distribution of carbon stocks and looking at net primary productivity, fire dynamics and the impacts thereof, effects of climate change as well, range shift and changes in carbon stocks. And lastly, direct drivers of land use over time. That's critical, and how these impact on these stocks or also on biodiversity. Secondly, to understand potential climate change mitigation opportunities. In other words, what are the principal climate change mitigation opportunities in South Africa? Secondly, we need to understand implementation options. That's very important. Who, in terms of agencies, what are the economics around this? Jobs, and Sally spoke about trade-offs. We must be clear where there's trade-off issues. Third, opportunities for scaling up implementation to a national scale. And what are we really in pursuit of here? Lastly, it's important also to look at the policy space. Is the policy space supportive or not? Are the policies current, relevant, or do we need to tweak some of these? So these are the objectives that informed the first study on National Terrestrial Carbon Sinks Assessment. So quickly, what were the results? So the results showed that if we look at the pie chart to the top left, clearly showed us that the largest carbon repositories in the country are basically the savanna system and the grassland system. And the third largest would be your cultivated land. And this is just to remind us of the vegetation biomes across the country. And here one can clearly see that we also looked at what is really the storage in terms of grams of carbon per square meter. And you can clearly see that the forests that they get, as well as the plantations that come out tops. But what was of great interest was that the bulk of carbon, about 93%, so is stored in the soil system. So it was also important now to recognize that fact that focus, whatever we do in managing this system, should not only be on above ground systems, but also soils are equally important. So then once we had a clear understanding of the distribution of the carbon stocks across the country and the fluxes, it was important to also explore, are there opportunities that are presenting for carbon sequestration? So these were the results that we came up with. So we identified what one would basically refer to as an activity, but also made it clear to elucidate these in terms of subclasses from mainly a subtropical thicket, the coastal and scarp forests, and broadleaf woodleaf, which are pretty much natural systems. And the grassland systems as well, the different grassland systems from your mesic to dry as well. And other opportunities that present trade-offs, which were about commercial small grower afforestation, which were clear on those in terms of why those were sort of considerable options on certain parts and landscapes. And then things like biomass energy from possibly debushing of bush encroached areas and alien invasive species, biomass energy, anaerobic biogas digesters, also looking at how do we utilize the biomass we've harvested, possibly making biochar and utilizing it, in many ways. Reduced tillage options where there's agricultural activity, and also looking into what we call reducing deforestation, emissions from deforestation and degradation, REDD+, if you like. And we also provided estimates in terms of spatial extent, and these would potentially translate into reduction of greenhouse gas emissions over a 20-year period, roughly by this. So, and for each and every intervention here, we were clear to equally identify the adaptation benefits. So quickly, what did we learn from the National Terrestrial Carbon Sinks Assessment? Well, we've learned that the grassland and savanna biomes contain approximately 3/4, that is about 60% of the country's terrestrial carbon stocks, and it accounts for over 90% of the gross primary production. As I said earlier on, 93% of the carbon is stored in soil. And this is just to give an indication of the total ecosystem organic carbon across the country. So one can clearly see that the eastern seaboard, it's really where the bulk of the carbon is, both above and below ground, as well as some parts along the coast of the country. So this was very important to give us a sense of what's the state of play in relation to carbon dynamics and where opportunities present for carbon sequestration, which is mainly through restoration of degraded systems. And a whole lot of key messages came up from this study. And these are just a few of the ones I just lifted off. And that the main thing is to realize that these systems are both a source and a sink for carbon. And secondly, the key thing is to really, where we can, to prevent land transformation, because then that releases carbon. And that's what we need to avoid if possible, but where we need to then rather resort to measures that really reduce the release of carbon, which is no tillage agriculture, agricultural approaches basically. And as we've seen, the savannas and grassland systems are South Africa's biggest terrestrial carbon pools. And lastly, the thicket biome in particular is massive carbon loss through degradation with high potential for sequestration through restoration. And this is important to emphasize because we hear people going around the country encouraging that plant 2 spec boom trees, and then your carbon footprint is taken care of for life. So we have to be really clear that this is supposed to happen in the respective area where the spec boom is located naturally, which is in the Eastern Cape in the thicket biome. So this was again a very important lesson that we learned, that it's important that we take a nexus approach. And a nexus approach because it allows us to really pursue adaptation, which is very important for South Africa and for the continent at large. So as we rehabilitate those systems that we've identified or putting those measures in place, we will actually progressively get to a point where the structure and function of these systems integrate, and they present 2 opportunities. The one is mitigation opportunities, which is the enhancement of the carbon pools, of course, depending on the management regimes that you put in place. And eventually that's the contribution from a mitigation perspective. But also you gain adaptation or resilience of these ecosystems in the long term, of course, depending on the management regimes that you put in place. And people are central, into this whole thing. So a nexus approach really is a way to go, because it enables us to really benefit largely from the adaptation perspective.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating, and again highlights the complexity of the problem that we face and the opportunity that we face. So on that note, it would be wonderful to hear from our next speaker, Dorothy Naitore. Dorothy is a leader in the International Small Group and Tree Planting Program, and really working on the ground with smallhold farmers as they plant trees and improve their farming and agriculture practices in favor of the climate. She's worked with many different organizations and community groups, and is a farm owner herself. So joining us from Kenya, Dorothy, thank you so much. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Sally, for giving me this opportunity. I really want to thank the planners of this meeting. As you have mentioned, my name is Dorothy Naitore from Kenya. I'm a typical African woman, and I work with a program contest as a volunteer and a farmer, because also I belong to a small group called Mwendo Mwega. If you want to get me easily, you can tap 2005 KE 430. That is my small group. I joined the program 2005 when it was introduced in Kenya, and I happened to be one of the pioneers, the 80 participants who attended the program. And I'm so happy to announce to you that from the 8 participants, we have over 100,000 participants participating in this program. We have over 20 million trees planted and verified and quantified by our local farmers. So I'm so proud to be here to share with you the outcomes or the results, or whatever I'm going to bring to you is the result which has been brought by involvement of a local small group farmer like Dorothy. As I've mentioned earlier, you can see my first slide that we started only with 80 participants, especially in Kenya. And because we are in East Africa, in India, Tanzania, and Uganda, you can see the numbers of the participants, all the farmers who are involved in this program. Those are the numbers. I think each one of you can go through and look at it. You can see the number of growths or the hectareage we have been able to recover by doing or implementing tree planting, which we normally encourage farmers themselves to make their own choice. If they tend to do the agroforestry trees, fruit trees, nut trees, we have achieved that. You can see we have 90+ million tons of carbon sequestered That is through the trees we have planted. We were the #1 in the world to get verified by the BCS, and also we become #1 in the world to be verified with the VCS CCB, which is allowing us to have triple gold for our premiums. All these kind of activities we are engaged, our farmers, they are getting 70% of the carbon profit to the farmer, and we are really thankful for the people who started the program, because when we started, we were looking just only for the carbon, but we didn't know we are going to have more results, because you can see the Sustainable Development Goals. I can tell you for sure, in the program, we have achieved almost everything, because when you go to education, we are doing it in a cluster meetings. We have empowered so many leaders through our rotational leadership and other kind of things. You can go through that. And next slide, please. I think when we start talking or even saying about carbon credit or even climate change, you can see that is the first picture there elaborates what we mean by deforestation and degradation. There are some people or something which has happened we want to fix so that we can stop this problem of climate change. There is that picture of degraded area, no trees, the soil is erupting, soil erosion. But when farmers are given opportunity of training and given information they need, resources they want, you can see the positive transformation in the other head, similar to that one. And when we talk about this impact, positive changes in landscape, this is exactly what we mean by engaging small groups and doing the right thing. They started seeing they are the ones to do that thing to fix their own problem, be it for food security for their own farm. Actually, I would say Africa, it is disadvantaged. I happened to go to US when we were going to do some presentation, and I met huge stores for food. But in Africa, whatever we plant is what we consume. So it is when we start engaging our farmers, it is fixing their own problem, because like now where I live in Meru, there are no rains, meaning in few months we will be having a lot of drought. Thank you. Next slide, please. Now we come here and we start thinking in a few years what has happened. After we started recruiting and bringing farmers together and sharing best practices, people have started seeing what each one of them can do. You can see this impact, positive changes in livelihood. You can see some farmers have now adopted using energy saving stoves. You can see there are some farmers who have adopted putting up beehives because they are going to be getting honey. And the honey, we know there this, when we talk about biodiversity, you cannot have fruit like mango, you can see there, and oranges if we don't have beans. So all the activities we are taking, it is like coexisting, and it is building benefits. When we are just looking at carbon, it is bringing many other core benefits. Those are our farmers, and those are the results of like 10 years. And I think we are doing together with all those very fine benefits are over 160 million created by farmers and only for carbon is $8 plus for trees. So meaning, when we talk about carbon credit, we can focus on that thing, but it has more core benefits. Thank you. Next slide, please. Now, this is where we start by doing our carbon thing. Farmers get information they need. They get organization and the resources. You can see that man is holding a seedling. When seedling is planted, 6 months, it is through our policies in Kenya, it says when you plant a seedling in the farm, it stays for 6 months. That one has a surety of growing. So we start doing the quantification. You can see there is a gentleman there holding a tape measure, taking the circumference of that tree, because the circumference of the tree and the data determines how much carbon has been sequestered, which stands to the money. That group is where we have small groups of 6 to 12 members meeting every month in a venue called cluster. Cluster is somewhere where 30 to 50 small groups within a walking distance meet, get training, get payment, all kind of education is done there. You go down there, you get our computers, meaning we have some people out every day correcting the data. And when they get synchronizing that of data, we get the results, and then people start getting farmers start getting their 70% payment. Thank you. Next slide, please. This is our main website, and I would request you click to review the recent quantified. Now, when we talk in the program about the data, I've heard other speakers talking about the quality data. In TIST, we have trained our local community or local farmers on how to use the available gadget to take the data, because we agree on whatever we are doing should be of good quality. And they go out with their Android phone. They have a very specific soft wires inside. They take the data. You can look at that grove. It is Beatrice Farm. It has different types of species. You can see ages. You can see the circumference. That is the detailed information we are taking so that we can make sure we have data. You can see another farmer. Those are some of the exactly the information we are taking in the field to make sure we have the quality data. Next, please. I think we can go in details. No, please get back, because excuse me, we get back to that slide for the data correction, because I wanted us to go further to see that growth, the circumference, and even the Google map. We thank Google because you can randomly pick any information here. Yes, thank you. That is what we talk about in other project. This is a group is one of our projects, and it's very tiny because we are engaging very, very small farmers in Africa, because we know they are most vulnerable people. That is a small area. It's a project area. It's 0.17 hectares. And I'm sure there are so many other farmers who are even smaller than that. You can take your GPS reading, go there, and also you can get the neighbor. That is how the detailed report we are taking. Next, please. Next slide. Now we have come here and there is something happening here. These dots, yellow dots, represent all the information you have seen previously in our data collection. When somebody goes out, they take all that information, this data starts coming up. I live somewhere here in Meru, and you can see how those dots, yellow dots, have come up, meaning that we have worked very hard to go out and educate other farmers, recruited more. And also I got some opportunity to go further to do expansion. That time we were saying it is social entrepreneur, and we have really recruited. You can see it's like a magical thing, because when we talk about climate change, our farmers have now started realizing they are the ones to fix the problem. And when we talk about carbon credit, also looking at the policies and every scientific proofs, we as the program, we are determined by giving back to the farmers who have worked, who have done a lot of work. We know policies can come in, and when they come, whatever is happening, we know who is doing a lot of work. We usually look at giving back to farmers who are working very hard. Thank you so much. Let's continue. I think each one of us can see this happening. It has just happened last season. In Kenya, we had a lot of rains, but now it is very dry. That lot of rains and the flooding caused a lot of landslide. This farm is one of our members, living some few miles from my area. They happen to have this, and they had grown tea, and that tea was dumped inside their cattle, which were dumped as well. And this shows clearly the climate change is with us. All the consequences of the climate change is with us, and now the farmers themselves have started fixing the problem, and that's why you can see the other side. Already there are some activities which has been done. They have started planting trees. They have started even putting up napier grass for their cattle, and now we can see the restoration of that mudslide. Those are some of the, we are calling them positive impact by farmers themselves fixing the problem. And I think this is my last slide, and it is showing most of the best practices which we have developed as farmers. The farmers are in their rest seedbed, because we have realized seedbed can give us quality seedlings. And for the last 22 years, we have seen what transformation we have seen as the program and the farmers who have engaged. Like myself, when we are talking, can carbon credit work in Africa? I can say I'm a testimony, because I joined the program when I was a housewife. From housewife getting information, I started my own nursery like this one. I started selling my own seedlings. I bought my own farm of 2 acres. Now I can feed my family, I can take my children to the school, and I can be able to go out and encourage other women. And what I didn't mention in the first slide is that the program is giving women opportunity, equal opportunity with the men. If it's doing the codification, women are given opportunity. If it's training, we are given opportunity. So as a woman, I'm so proud, and I can speak out and say carbon can work in Africa because it has worked for over 10,000 members in TIST and many more. Small farmers in Africa need something like this because we look at the carbon, but we have so many other core benefits. Thank you. That is what I had prepared for this meeting. And thank you so much for listening to me. I'm looking forward for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy. Thank you so much for sharing. And it's so wonderful to hear real examples where, as you know, Sally and Barney both alluded to, much of the theory is sort of posed by academia, and a lot of the examples and calculations are not based on real African experiences or African data. So it's been fantastic to learn more about your sort of long-term work and the direct impacts and implications of that. I think we've run a little bit over time today. So what we usually do is we have a Q&A now based on all of the questions that come through on the chat. And shortly thereafter, we actually pause recording and we cross over into a free-flowing, very open Q&A session. What I might do is just sort of close off this session and then ask Robert Inglis from Jive Media to host the Q&A session, given that we may have to handle it a little bit differently to what we usually do. I hope that you've enjoyed being with us for this, the third Tipping Point series. Please remember that to re-watch the webinar, you can visit our YouTube channel, which is Oppenheimer Generations Research and Conservation. We'll also share the link after today through our social media channels, and feel free to visit our new website, which is OGRC-funded.org. So let's continue the conversation. Robert, I might ask you to facilitate some Q&A at this point.
Thanks very much, Julie, and thanks very much to all of the panelists. Really fascinating conversations and really, really wonderful input. I think our knowledge of some of these topics often needs a little bit of broadening, and we've certainly had that today. I was struck, I suppose, by just one thought, and that is that there does seem to be ways of moving towards this future. We know that there's complexity. We know that it has to be managed very carefully and very sensitively, but we can also see that there are possible ways of doing that. So really, really very inspired and excited. So a huge thanks once again to all of the speakers. We did have some questions that people submitted ahead of the session. I'm going to drop a couple of these into the conversation, and I think let's give ourselves about 10 or 15 minutes to handle some of these, but we'd really like to open the floor and let others ask questions as well. So I think one of the questions that has come through is about carbon credits having received criticism as a fictitious commodity. I think we've seen some countering to that, but how true or not is this critique? And is there a standardized method or methodology of quantifying carbon credits? So I think we've seen one example there. I'm not sure if anyone wants to jump in and respond to this question about the standardized method or methodology of quantifying carbon credits, and perhaps whether that methodology is applicable in Africa as it is elsewhere.
I think one of the complexities is that some parts of the carbon cycle are easier to measure than others. So it is easier to measure above ground biomass in trees, for example, than it is to measure below ground soil carbon. So even though, as Barney pointed out, below ground soil carbon is a much larger stock and it's much more secure, it's a much better way to sequester, it's really hard to demonstrate that you're storing carbon below ground and much easier to demonstrate above ground. There is a website called the Vera Standards where people are trying to develop standard methodologies for accounting for carbon stocks. Some of those protocols and methods are much better than others. And we are trying to engage specifically around kind of the methods around livestock management and the impacts that that has on soil carbon. I think there's a lot of room for improvement there. And we're hoping that our colleagues in South Africa and Africa can help.
Barney, have you got something to add?
Yes, thanks. I see Tony has his hand up. I'm probably going to say pretty much what he was going to contribute. But yeah, just to mention that there are some standards out there on how to measure these and I mean carbon capture and storage. And these keep improving over time as people get to understand, you know, some of the areas that would include, for instance, the science part of the methodologies to measure this, and also we commissioned a study, for instance, immediately after the National Terrestrial Carbon Sinks Assessment study that looked into developing a standard for South Africa. And we clearly identified steps and interventions that we need to get to a point where we have a national standard. But also began to identify certain interventions that can perhaps fast track, you know, certain aspects which will encourage projects and so on in certain areas. So yeah, and I know for a fact that people who, in South Africa, there may be like one or two looking into developing standards that may be relevant to the South African setting, but I don't have much information on that. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Barney. And Shabnaz, could you confirm whether you've opened that chat for others to ask questions? Are you able to perhaps come on, Tony?
Oh, great. Yeah, as Sally and Barney mentioned, there are a set of international standards. Vera is the leading one, perhaps, together with the gold standard. And in terms of an African perspective on it, most of the projects in Africa, including the TIST program, are often leading the way in this, in that they are going through the international standards like Vera, the gold standard, and one or two others. And what's actually interesting to see is that many developed countries, like, for example, projects in the United States and elsewhere, are really trying to catch up and get up to the standard of the projects that are being implemented across Africa.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Tony. That's really useful. And I noticed that Sally has put a link in the chat, and you can have a look for further information there. I noticed that a number of the questions that were asked during the session have actually been responded to in the chat. But Andele Mtimunye asked, are the trees, and I think this is a question to Dorothy, are the trees native to the areas in which they are planted? So, and is there a way of selecting tree species that absorb more carbon compared to others? And I think there was another question around whether there would be a replacement of agricultural foods with, I think in particular, avocado and mango. So perhaps Dorothy, if you wanted to respond on that one, is there some level of guidance provided in terms of what trees are appropriate and only planting in spaces that are appropriate for that vegetation?
Thank you so much for that good question. And before even I answer that one, I can say this program has a lot of examples of standards, and we can share with you because we have thousands of groves which we have gone through the standards and they have been certified. The answer to that is, before we engage community members or even the farmers, we give them a training for 6 months. We call it application process, so that people can have the information they need, the organization, and they feel I need to be involved in this carbon thing. So in that process, we give community members opportunity to give the species which grow in their area, because through the results and the experience, we have noted that when you import or bring different species from different other areas, they don't do very well. So farmers themselves identify trees which grow very well in their area, and also we facilitate them to identify the right species of fruits, nuts, according to the attitude of their area. That is how they come up with the right species, and especially because we are working with on-farm, many of the farmers, they integrate the trees with the crops. So most of them pick the agroforestry trees. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dorothy. Yes, I'm struck. Of course, there's an incentive to grow a fruit tree because it produces fruit, but I'm wondering whether there's incentive to grow just locally occurring species because of the carbon credits. So how much, or because of that input, what's the balance there? Are there some trees that are worth growing just for the credits?
Actually, we have two different species we call eucalyptus and non-eucalyptus, because in this program we are wanting trees which can go over 30-60 years. There are some people who do plant trees like eucalyptus for commercial, and for commercial in this carbon business, it is high risk trees. So we have classified them eucalyptus and non-eucalyptus. We have indigenous, we have fruit trees, nut trees, founder trees, and we pay the same amount of money. So we don't discriminate, saying this has more carbon, because all those species do the same work. But also we really encourage our farmers to do like fruit trees, because with the fruit trees, nut trees, we are improving the nutrition, we are improving the food security, soil erosion, all those kind of things, and then they get that small incentive for carbon credit.
Fantastic. Thanks for that clarity. We've got about 10 minutes left, and this session is now open. I don't want to dominate all the questions, and I'm sure there's been lots of food for thought. And so I wonder if there are any hands up, any burning questions that people would like to ask in the chat. We've got some experts for you to respond, and we'd really love to hear your thoughts. There's a hand up. Oh, Sally's got a question. Great.
Yeah, I suppose I think the work that Armani's done has shown that sort of agroforestry, as Dorothy points out in the TISC program, is one of the key interventions that could have co-benefits. And then the other one is grazing management. And I know there are people in the audience, maybe they're still here, who have thoughts on that and have been working on it, like different ways to manage our grazing ecosystems, mixing up the type of herbivores. One idea that came up at the workshop was switching from cows to ostriches because they aren't ruminants, so like massively reduced emissions. So that's another one where there's some lovely creative ideas that could come out of Africa with an African perspective. And I was wondering if anyone in the audience had some thoughts on that.
Thanks, Sally. And I see Michael Osei has also asked for a second time, why Africa? And I don't know if I fully understand the question, but I think there's a real opportunity. It seems like there's a real opportunity for us in Africa to answer this question about how Africa is going to engage with this international marketplace. So I think for us and for OGRC, it's really a question about how can we sustainably and positively engage with this marketplace. But Michael, perhaps you'd like to elucidate a little bit on that question, and perhaps get a little bit more of what you're really asking for the panelists.
Okay, thank you, Robert. I think based on the statistics shown by Sally, it looks as if there is a high chance of we being able to produce a lot of carbon from Africa. But what is making Africa gain that grounds to produce a lot of carbon? That's my question. Yeah.
Thank you, Michael. I understand. Can I answer that? Is that okay, Barney?
By all means, thank you.
Actually, other continents are taking up even more carbon than Africa. So many of the abandoned farmlands in North America and Europe are accumulating carbon at massive rates, way more than Africa. But they're also emitting excessive amounts of fossil fuel carbon. So their net, like, even though there's forests in Africa, in North America taking up lots of carbon, North America is emitting far more carbon than it's taking up. So I think Africa is of interest, firstly, because it's so big, and secondly, because people think there's more room there and more space and more land, but often they don't quite realize that our land is valuable to us in Africa as well. And many times, so, you know, afforestation is much more effective in Europe than in Africa because the trees grow bigger and there's less fire. But people think in Europe there's not enough space, like they think they're using their land in Europe. That's what my colleagues tell me. And so then there's focus on Africa because there's a sense that like Africa has land resources that can be used. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. It does. It does. But in your presentation, you made mention of about we producing about 4%. I was just trying to bring to perspective in terms of the production of the emission, then the production. Now, I'm sure now our weathers are changing due to climate change. From now, if you come to Ghana, I'm in Ghana. We used to have the rainfall and also the dry season, but now it's actually changing. How can we mitigate that and still produce a lot of carbon as expected?
So that's the other thing, is there's risks associated with some of these carbon mitigation projects because climate change might limit their capacity. That's what you're suggesting. So that is something that is hard to bring into the carbon accounting. As Dorothy says, people are often paid beforehand for the carbon that they think will accumulate. And if there's a massive drought and the trees all die, then they've been paid for the carbon, but the trees have died. So I think you're highlighting some very important questions around the risk of some of these projects.
Okay, thank you very much. So Sally, we will talk. I would send you a message and we'll talk in terms of even measuring the carbon footprint. You know, is something that has a lot of complexity as well. But I think I would text you, then we'll talk. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, thanks very much. And I see Duncan Kimuyu has a response to Sally's question around mixed grazing systems. And then I note a hand up from Ben Henniker.
Thanks for the opportunity. I hope you can hear me. I work in some of the systems where we have mixed grazing systems in Kenya between livestock and wildlife. And we'll be doing a bit of research there to also understand the perspective of how we can manage land best for the carbon credit. And one of the cool things that we've been able to demonstrate from our system is that, you know, when you have a fine mixture of livestock and wildlife together, you can manage the land better for carbon, as opposed to when you just have livestock, which in a sense turns out to be net exporters of carbon. But then with the mixture of particularly elephants, you can at least save the land from, you know, net exporting carbon. So I don't know whether that responds to Sally.
Thanks, Duncan. The chat has come alive with questions, lots of questions to be considered, and really obviously a topic that needs further time and conversation. I'd just like to ask Ben Henniker's got a hand up, so if you'd like to go ahead. But if anyone would like to respond to any of the questions in the chat, please do by all means have a little go in the chat. And if anyone wants to find out more information about any of the conversations that have taken place, please do write to us, and we can certainly link you to these experts for further discussions. Let me ask Ben, you go ahead.
I just wanted to make one comment from the 20 plus years that TIST has been going on. It was focused and started to try to help improve the livelihoods of the farmers. It wasn't started to be a carbon project or to do that, as that was looking for some source of income that would be sustainable, because NGOs come and NGOs go and programs come and go, and that doesn't work if you're trying to actually do carbon. But the thing I would suggest, Sally, you might look into is that the marketplace is a very demanding effect. You don't get money for the carbon until the carbon is proven to be sequestered, which is a 7 to 10 year process. And so what happens is that actually the people like Dorothy are benefited by the standards and the quality of the science improving. Because then if you are doing the right thing and you can prove it over many years, then you actually do earn income. And when you don't have that tension between the buyer and the seller, you have debating papers and studies, and there's not an arbiter. But people who, before they pay money, think that they're supposed to get what they paid for. And so they actually are a force for improving the standards at Vera or Gold Standard and so on. So just as you're thinking about all these systems, be aware that there's this funny part that the buyer demands quality, where unfortunately the rest of us who are trying to just ask for quality or try to prove quality don't have that same power.
Can I ask you, while I have your attention, and thank you so much for attending in the middle of the night, what is the consequence for the buyer if they don't get the quality? I've always wondered, in a normal situation where you're buying a cow, you want your cow to be high quality. When you're buying a carbon offset on the other side of the world, as long as the Vera standards tell you the carbon's there, do you really care whether the carbon is there? You're getting your carbon credits. So I'm not sure that the buyer in this case is the holder of the standards, because as long as you get your carbon offset credits, do you care whether the carbon is there on the ground?
Well, yes, it's actually quite noticeable. The prices of the carbon credits are incredibly variable. And there are carbon credits out there that maybe are worth something, and then technology changes. When you first did wind or solar, you could earn a carbon credit because you were a pioneer. But now those no longer count because those technologies have.
Yeah, I think it's really useful to get this insight, because perhaps other people in the discussion know what the consequences are if you invest in a carbon scheme that doesn't actually store the carbon. What are the consequences for the buyer?
And I imagine what I'm certainly hearing is that there are good and bad carbon credits that you can buy, and in a marketplace those would have different prices attached to them. And having a marketplace without some of the elements of marketplaces can potentially be problematic, or perhaps not achieve the desired aims. We've reached 2:31, and there are a few more comments in the chat. What I would like to do is to really just take this opportunity to say a huge thanks to all of our presenters and to all of you for being here. We've still got quite a large number of people in the room an hour and a half later, and thanks really for bearing with us and for participating in this conversation. We would like to share the Oppenheimer Generations Research and Conservation web details in the chat, just because that's a space where you would be able to write to any of the participants of this workshop. So please do, Shadnaz has shared that in the chat, please do have a look on that website. You'll also see this presentation or this seminar in a few days' time. We'll have that loaded up with a little bit of a write-up about it. and we really value your ongoing engagement. We do this on a monthly basis, and please do look out, sign up for the newsletters, and in due course, please do join us for another Tipping Points conversation. Once again, huge thanks to Sally, to Barney, and of course to Dorothy, and also to Julie Cheetham at Oppenheimer Generations for facilitating this conversation. Thanks very much, everyone, and we'll wrap it there. We look forward to seeing you next time.